Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Dubuque Museum of Art. My name is Mark Waller. I'm the director here. It's a pleasure to see so many smiling, happy people on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. Thank you for joining us for what is the continuing sixth season, our famous Dead Artist series. We couldn't be more pleased to be able to continue to present this popular program. There's some people I'd like to thank before we get started today. First of all, I have to start off by thanking our wonderful staff, Diane Sass, Stacy Peterson. And of course, it's always hard to pick on just one staff person, but with this program in particular, Margaret Burr, who writes all of the scripts, does all of the research, helps both myself and our actors help recreate these roles. So she puts in here. Without much exaggeration, for each of these scripts, Margaret puts in about 6 months of work between the research and the writing. So it's an enormous task, and I'm so thankful for her talents and her hard work. And this is our 16th script that we're performing today. 17th? 17th.
Who's counting?
But who's counting? That's right. And she actually is beginning work on our next script, which will feature Marlena Dietrich on December 14th or December 15th. Also starring Lenore Howard, who's with us here. And I also want to thank our wonderful actor here today, Andrew Firsty Henry, who has put in tens, if not dozens, of hours on his own, helping to recreate this wonderful artist from the past. It's been a pleasure getting to know him through this. Pretty soon we're only going to know him as Paul Gauguin, but while we're still on the character, it's just a pleasure to have him as part of this. He's really, really phenomenal. I think you'll enjoy what he does today. And finally, I have to thank our wonderful sponsors, Ed and Susie Ritz. Thank you so much. And I always have to give, when I start these, special nod to Ed. This was really his brainchild. He created these. It's always a team effort, as we know, but Ed, thank you so much for this wonderful program. I hope we do it justice and continue the legacy. So thank you very much. Now, I guess it's probably appropriate today, before we bring out Monsieur Gauguin, to wish everybody a happy Bastille Day, which is one of the reasons why we chose this date, and also this happened work, so thank you for that. But without further ado or further introductions, it's my honor to present to all of you Monsieur Paul Gauguin. Good afternoon, Mr. Gauguin.
Bonjour, Monsieur Waller.
Please, would you join me?
Yeah, merci.
Now, welcome to Dubuque and to the Dubuque Museum of Art, and thank you for your willingness to share your story with us today.
Yeah, merci. My introspective days are past, and it would be best for me to hold my tongue, but it is a strain to hold one's tongue when one is full of a desire to speak.
Now, you've agreed to this program for several reasons, but one of the main ones is because you believe actually that your reputation, both in the art world and beyond, remains conflicted, even after all of these years.
I care little if you think I was a good man or a bad man. Virtue, good, and evil, these are but words. As for whether I was a good artist or a bad artist, our critics are still making up their minds. You are all welcome to your own decision on this matter. Perhaps at the conclusion of this dubious exercise, you will have a clear understanding of what I was trying to do as an artist and why art was the only thing that mattered to me. But before we begin, I would like to ask your audience, what comes to mind when you hear my name?
Well, fair enough. Would anybody in the audience like to share what they know or what they've heard about Monsieur Gauguin? Yeah, please.
Well, to say the least, Monsieur Gauguin, you were a model for male midlife crisis.
Run amok midlife crisis. Yes, please.
I know you were a deadbeat dad and you abandoned your wife and children.
No mincing words there, of course. Anybody else, please? You've got one other, please.
You went to Tahiti. That's quite a ways from your other places you lived.
That's right. And one more, please.
I heard that you drove Vincent Van Gogh to madness, and then deserted Vincent when he cut off part of his ear.
Well, you've heard some interesting comments here, Monsieur. I wonder how you would react.
Well, I have heard it before. As Napoleon said, what is history but a fable agreed upon?
Indeed, indeed. Well, at least on my behalf and hopefully on our audience's behalf, we'll try and be more open-minded this afternoon.
Merci. My story is a quest, a search for understanding, for freedom from responsibility for myself and for my art. It is composed of equal parts hope and disillusion. I'm ready when you are.
Okay, thank you. I think perhaps as we usually start with our artists, one of the best places is to start with biology. Many believe that biology is destiny. What role did your ancestry play in your character?
Well, I'm a savage from Peru. Inca blood runs through my veins. It is reflected in everything I do and is the basis of my personality.
Well, if you wouldn't mind going a bit deeper, tell us, let's start with your mother's family.
My grandmother, Flora Tristan, I was born into a Peruvian family of wealth and position. She was just a teenager when she married my grandfather, the printmaker, André Chazelle. Chazelle had a terrible temper, and grandmother refused to put up with his abuse. She left him after 3 years. She left without her children, for she had no right to take them under French law. Years later, grandmother learned that Chazelle was forcing himself upon Eileen, his daughter. She took him to court and won custody of the children. Chazelle sought revenge and shot her. Grandmother survived, and grandfather spent the rest of his life in prison.
To use a modern-day parlance, it sounds a little bit like a Jerry Springer show, if you understand that reference.
A happy family is nothing but a fairy tale.
Now, your grandmother, Flora, whom you're describing, actually goes on to become quite a respected writer and activist, and she actually champions the rights of women, workers, children.
Well, grandmother was an amusing lady. She was an anarchist blue stocking. She was involved in many socialist affairs, workers' unions among them. I'm certain she did not know how to cook.
Now, Flora unfortunately dies when your mother is yet a teenager, leaving her in the care of her good friend, the novelist George Sand. Now, Sand was a pretty cultured bohemian whose friendships included many of the leading artists of the day, including Delacroix, the writer Gustave Flaubert, and in fact the composer Frédéric Chopin, with whom he had a long-term relationship.
My mother was an exotic orchid among the French lilies. Beneath her outer beauty lay an inner strength and resilience. Madame Sand had the means to give her a fine education, but instead she found her husband, Clovis Gauguin, who became my father.
Now, the Gauguins were a pretty conventional middle-class people. They didn't have the dysfunction or the social connections of your mother's family.
Yeah. The Gauguins had been market gardeners in Orléans for generations, exporting produce and flowers to Paris in the north. My grandfather wanted a better life for his son, and he sacrificed much to give him a good education. When my father left school, he broke with family tradition and found work in the newspaper business.
And in fact, your father, Clovis, was a political correspondent and later editor of Le National, a radical Republican newspaper in Paris.
My father had an opinion about everything. He enjoyed the conversation at literary salons. It was at one of these that he met my mother.
And in fact, that blossoms, and they marry in 1846. Their first child, Marie, is born a year later, and you closely follow on June 7th, 1848. You're christened as Eugene Henri Paul. You are painted as an infant staring confidently at the world with wide blue eyes.
Here I am, ready to do battle with the world. Armed with the Tristan fearlessness, the Chazelle temperament, and the Gauguin resolve.
I think that's probably quite a combination. Now, after Napoleon III's coup d'etat, your father's actually forced to leave France to escape right-wing reprisals. He takes the family to Lima, Peru, to live with Aileen's wealthy family, and he actually intends to start a newspaper there. You've just celebrated at this time your first birthday.
I remember nothing of my father. He died of a stroke on the ship and was led to his eternal rest somewhere in the Straits of Magellan.
Now, left with 2 young children to support, your mother finds refuge in the elegant mansion of her great-uncle, Don Pio de Tristan Moscoso.
I have a remarkable visual memory, and I remember this time of life, our home and many things that happened. The red, yellow, and green pattern of the terracotta tile, the carved wooden dome of the church, mulatto servants, the Chinese launderer who was so clever at ironing, and the madman who was chained to the rooftops and would sometimes escape and wander into my room. Yeah, on the streets it was less picturesque. Buzzards were in charge of garbage collection, and they were far from efficient.
I would imagine not. Now, another early memory is of your mother wearing a manteau, which is the mysterious sort of one-eye veil that was a part of the traditional costume of Lima.
Mother had a sort of indescribable allure that I found irresistible even then.
Now, while in Lima, your mother begins collecting pre-Columbian pottery, and many were highly decorative pieces. In fact, they were used as grave decorations.
Many found these works strange and disturbing, but I understood them, and I found them wonderful.
Now, your interlude in Peru lasts 6 years. When your uncle's political power begins to erode, your mother decides it's time to leave, and you set sail for France in early 1855. And at this time, you're not quite 7 years old.
The commotion of our departure overshadowed any sadness at leaving what had been my first home. Later, I would long to return to such a place.
Now, in fact, it's on this journey back to France that you actually create one of your first works of art.
I was a restless child. Mother gave me a piece of wood to carve to keep myself out of trouble.
Now, returning to France, you spend 5 years with your Gauguin grandfather in Orléans, but you seem to have had a difficult time adjusting to the new environment.
Well, I spoke and understood only Spanish. I learned the French of my father's country quickly, but I always felt more comfortable with the Spanish of my mother's people.
Now, you begin as a student at a local boarding school, and you actually impress your teachers with your dexterity and your flair for learning.
Yeah, one teacher said, "This child will either be a genius or an idiot."
Now, a few years later, at age 11, you are enrolled in the little seminary of the Chapelle Saint-Mesmin, a preparatory school for aspiring priests. It's a classical education deeply steeped in Catholic doctrine.
Our day began at 5 in the morning with prayers. We washed and dressed and went to chapel, more prayers. Classes went from 6:30 to 7 in the evening. Dinner was accompanied by a sermon, and we ended our day with more prayers before lights out at 8.
It's a lot of prayers for one day, I'd have to say. Now, despite your pleasure in learning, you're actually quite unhappy at school, and you begin to seek refuge in more solitary and introspective tasks.
Well, I cultivated the detachment of an observer and formed the habit of concentrating on myself and finding my own amusements.
Now, as we kind of alluded to, the religious atmosphere does not exactly turn you into an obedient Catholic.
On the contrary, I learned to hate hypocrisy, sham virtue, and tale-bearing, and to distrust anything that was contrary to my heart, my reason, and my instinct.
Now, while you're at school, your mother moves to Paris, where she supports herself as a seamstress and then actually opening up her own dress shop around 1861. She attracts a rich boyfriend, Gustave Arosa, a wealthy financier who actually works for the French branch of the Rothschild family.
I love my mother, but I was not a good son. She feared that my nature was so disagreeable that I would likely die alone.
Now, in 1865, you actually complete your education, and you join the crew of the Lusitano, a merchant marine ship, where you actually serve on board for about 6 years.
I was 17. I was cursed with a terrible itching for the unknown. I threw off the shackles of the seminary and breathed in deep the salt air.
Now, your maiden voyage lasts for 13 months, quite a long time, and takes you to Rio de Janeiro, where you have your first encounter as an adult with the so-called native peoples of South America.
I recall the sunlight playing on the tamarind trees, the oleander on the palm. It was a new and astonishing world, inhabited by a savage and primitive race.
Now, prior to your departure from France, a friend gives you a letter of introduction to one of Rio's leading actresses, Madame Amy.
I learned to overthrow my virginity and with haste the skillful Amy dispensed with my virtue. The soil proved propitious, for I became a great rascal.
Now, while at sea, unfortunately, you learned that your mother actually died during a house fire that was destroyed during the Franco-Prussian War.
I returned home to find that everything I had known and loved was lost in the fire. All my childhood souvenirs. At 23, I began again. I took the position that what had come before had never been.
Now, in her will, your mother leaves legal guardianship of her family to Gustave Arosa. Arosa's business connections are able to secure you a position as a bookkeeper at the Bourse, the French stock exchange.
I was the office drudge. I was responsible for sorting out the deals and settling up at the end of the day. Lacking mathematical skill and a bookkeeper's temperament, I bluffed my way through, like an actor playing a part.
Now, again, during the weekends, however, you are able to stay at Arosa's country villa, where you're able to study his collection of Barbizon school paintings, including the works of Corot, Delacroix, and Jean-Francis Millet. Guests there also discuss politics, travel, and many of the latest trends in art. One guest in particular that I know you remember returns from a year-long world tour and recounts an unforgettable visit to Tahiti.
It was a more worldly and sophisticated education. A world full of ideas and possibilities, and I benefited from it.
Now, you also strike up a friendship with a co-worker, an amateur artist named Emil Schuffenecker. Now, he encourages your developing interest in art, and he critiques your sketches and later persuades you at a relatively advanced age of 27 to try painting.
Very good old Schuffy inoculated me with an obsession for art by taking me to galleries and museums. Sundays were reserved for painting. I started with watercolors, but quickly moved on to oils when Schuff showed me the correct way to mix them.
Now, you're also considered a good catch, and there are many Parisian mothers who try to tempt you with their daughters.
One day, I was treacherously taken to call on a respectable family who spoke of nothing but family virtue and household duties. Like a flash of lightning, I saw that marriage was a trap, and there is nothing so terrible as virtue.
Now, your reluctance to marry does waver when you are introduced to a young Danish woman, Mette Sophie God. Mette is a physically imposing blonde, and she's known for a rather blunt manner, her liberal use of expletives, and cigar smoking. Now, accustomed to strong women, you're quite consumed with her.
I could find a complacent female on any street corner. Mette intrigued me. Despite her great intelligence, she was really quite naive, for she had not yet learned to be afraid.
Now, Mette is less than enthusiastic about you as a prospective mate at first, and in fact, she introduces you to her family as, and I'm quoting here, a funny sort of Frenchman.
Mette had a heart of stone. She proved indifferent to my charms, which inflamed me even more. But within a year, my persistence had paid off, and we were engaged to be married.
Which you do in November 1873, settling in a rather large apartment, and your furnishings actually reflect your artistic sensibilities. You decorate them with rather simple handcrafted pieces, oriental rugs, Peruvian wall hangings. You dine off the boldly colored artisan ware rather than the more popular delicate china of the day.
And my choices were a protest against pretentious, vulgar, middle-brow taste, which I held in contempt.
Now, Emile, the first of your 5 children, is born just 9 months after your marriage, and 3 more sons and a daughter follow in very rapid succession.
Our children were a predictable outcome of our passionate natures.
Now, work at the stock exchange provides a comfortable living for you, but you prefer to spend your evenings sketching or working in the studio. Mette, however, enjoys socializing, but together you're able to cultivate a circle of friends and in the Spanish and Scandinavian communities.
Although it had been years since my days as a sailor, I was unaccustomed to civil discourse and uneducated as to what fork to use at a fancy dinner party. Met took responsibility for teaching me manners and morals. We ran into trouble when her ideas of virtue conflicted with my desires.
I would imagine so. Now, Met remains relatively unaware of your growing interest in art, which is actually becoming an all-consuming passion for you.
Met regarded my Sunday excursions as a pleasant hobby, preferable to drinking or gambling or keeping a mistress.
Now, in 1874, I would have to agree, in 1874 you attend the first Impressionist exhibition and make the acquaintance of Camille Pissarro, one of the original participants in the exhibition. Although you've had absolutely no formal training in art, he recognizes that you have an instinctive gift and introduces you to the group.
Pissarro and I recognized each other as outsiders. His father was a Portuguese Jew who had emigrated from the Virgin Islands. He was a simple man. He lived in the country with his wife and many children.
In fact, Pissarro encourages you to paint outdoors, in plein air.
I prefer the studio. Out in the sun, the painters line up. The first cup is nature, the second cup is the first, the third cup is the second. And not a fresh air can be pretty here and there, but it does not make a painting.
Now, although you've only been painting informally for a few years, you're confident enough to submit a landscape under the tree canopy at Viroflay to the Autumn Salon.
Well, a selection by the Salon can put an artist on the map. I shuffled in line like a prisoner with the other artists where the jurors scrutinized their work. It seemed like hours before I knew my work had been selected.
Now, you eventually leave the stock exchange to work in a bank. The more structured hours allow you actually more time for painting. Met is also pleased that you earn additional money by speculating on stocks and commodities.
I was proud of my well-dressed wife and her beautiful home, but I warned Met not to acquire a taste or a need for such things, for one never knows what tomorrow may bring.
And we'll find out here in a moment, I think. Now, Met seems to absorb that lesson when, in an effort to economize, you actually move the family to suburban Montparnasse. Your landlord is the sculptor Jules Bouillot, who encouraged you to try three-dimensional techniques. And in fact, you complete a marble bust of Met and Emile.
I was always good with my hands, and I learned sculpture with ease. Bouillot did most of the cutting, but I finished the works. I made Met softer than she was, and Emile more angelic.
Now, in due course, you actually master a number of mediums, including painting, sculpture, ceramics, others, but ultimately you really concentrate your efforts on painting.
Well, painting is the most beautiful of all the arts. In a single glance, our souls are flooded with the most profound reflections.
Now, on Christmas Eve, 1877, your only daughter is born, and you name her Aileen in memory of your mother.
Aileen represented the soft and gentle part of my life. She alone of all my children brought out my more tender instincts.
Now, next step for you is attending the Paris Third International Exposition in 1878, and you find a compelling source of inspiration in a large display of pre-Columbian works from Peru that had been collected by French archaeological missions.
The works they could not be explained and were unlike anything else in Europe at the time. I found their blunt realism refreshing, and I took nourishment from their primitive qualities.
Now, among the ceramics and textiles was a Peruvian mummy, a potent symbol of death and rebirth. It sat hunched behind drawn-up legs bound with cords, and its skull was offset by a wide mouth that almost appears to be screaming.
Oh, I visited the mummy many times. Its beauty stirred up longing in me and a desire for travel. But as a married man with 5 children, I had to content myself with postcards of faraway places I might visit someday.
Now, on Pissarro's advice, you collect the works of Impressionist artists and other avant-garde works, but you have quite a collection of works by Manet, Cézanne, Monet, others.
Yeah, the Impressionists couldn't give their works away. At first, I collected from them to ingratiate myself with the group. Later, I studied them to unlock their secrets.
Now, you're pleasantly surprised when the Impressionists expressed an interest in acquiring your art.
Degas, but from me. It was a handsome compliment. I didn't feel like a bookkeeper playing a painting.
Now, in 1880, you exhibit 8 works in the 5th Impressionist exhibition, but critics declare your work second tier and derivative of Pissarro, your mentor.
A critic meddles where he ought to mind his own business. But what he said did challenge me. Why should anyone follow his master? The reason he is a master is he didn't follow anyone.
Now, for the first time, one of your paintings, Nude Study Suzanne Sewing, receives critical mention at the 6th Impressionist exhibit.
A critic called it modern and alive. Another compared it to Rembrandt's treatment of the female form. I was considered the first artist in years to represent the modern woman.
Congratulations, high praise indeed. Now, just as you received critical recognition in the art world, your work life faces some extraordinary challenges. In January of 1882, the stock market crashes and your position at the bank is eliminated. You move your family to Rouen, where it's cheaper to live and where you can paint every day. To make ends meet, you actually cash in your life insurance policy and sell off many of the pieces of your art collection. Home life becomes, to say the least, stressful, and unfortunately you become verbally abusive to Met.
I had a wife incapable of living in poverty and 5 children to support. I couldn't embark on a career as an artist unless our needs could be met. I was not good at living frugally, but I was more committed than ever to the artistic struggle.
Now, when your 5th and last child is born, on the paperwork under occupation, you write artist.
Writing that word was liberating. There was no turning back.
Now, Met believes the family's future will be brighter in Denmark, and she sails ahead to Copenhagen to investigate job opportunities. She returns with news that she can earn a good living as a French teacher. And at the same time, you secure a position as a tarpaulin salesman when the family does eventually move to Denmark in late 1884.
What was I supposed to do? I hadn't a penny to my name. My preoccupation with art was keeping me from being a good employee in a business where dreamers are of no use. I reasoned that as a salesman, I could set my own hours and have more time for painting.
Now, you actually initially approached the sales position with quite a positive attitude, but you find the work pretty demeaning and you really don't have much success in that capacity.
Danish businessmen did not want French turbulence. I didn't speak Danish and I had to work through an interpreter. It was grim. I would show them samples. They said they would need more time to consider and I would never hear from them again.
Now, perhaps a bigger insult, the paintings of Danish life and landscapes that you make at this time go very much unappreciated. They don't receive any critical admiration, and you certainly believe that they did.
Well, I assumed that the Danish artists would welcome a chance to see what was new outside the provinces. I submitted my work to local exhibitions and I was passed over, ever so politely, without a word.
Now, Met, however, thrives in her native Copenhagen. She earns 60 francs a month as a teacher, and her classroom becomes the dining room, and you're then relegated to the attic.
Well, Met informed me there would be no more children, so the attic became my studio and my bedroom. I learned to hate the Danes.
Now, tensions continue to build in your marriage, and Met does not defend you against the taunts of her family, who find you derisive and don't like your comments on organized religion or Danish politics. Your verbal abuse to Met escalates to physical abuse on at least one documented occasion.
I struck Met in the face. I hated my work and no one wanted my paintings. In the eyes of her family, I was a monster. I was the missing link.
Now, after just 6 months of this, you return to Paris, seething with anger and bitterness, to say the least, and you leave Met and the children behind in Denmark.
I wanted known that I did not desert my family. I tried to make things right with them so I could be with them again. I ask you this. Would I have left what remained of my art collection with Met if I had no intention of returning?
Now, when you return, Parisians regard you as disreputable and a ne'er-do-well, and they believe you have abandoned your family. Your former friends, the Impressionists, keep you at arm's length, finding your unpredictable outbursts off-putting. In 1886, you participate in the 8th and final Impressionist exhibition, where you actually show 19 paintings and a carved wood relief. The works, however, receive little attention and are overshadowed by the enormous painting Sunday Afternoon on Le Grand Jatte by the new prodigy Georges Seurat.
Perry paid me back in full for my transgressions. I was an outlaw in a bourgeois world. I needed to find a place that could give me the pleasure that only art could give.
Now, frustrated, destitute, feeling unappreciated, you eventually make a trip to the artist colony of Pont-Aven in Brittany during the summer of 1886.
Misery turned my footsteps toward Brittany. It was cheaper than Paris. People think I went to paint the primitive Breton. Nonsense. If someone had told me that Provence was cheaper, I would have gone there.
Now, as soon as you arrive in Brittany, you feel more inspired and certainly much more at ease.
I found something savage and primitive there. When my clogs resounded on the granite soil, I heard the heavy, muffled, powerful notes I was seeking in my painting.
Now, the Bretons of Pont-Aven realize that they're actually sitting on a tourist gold mine, and they play up the illusion of a picturesque, quaint village that time had forgotten. And in fact, they do everything they can to facilitate the artists like yourself that live there.
Well, I quickly filled notebooks with drawings. Drawings were my letters. They held my secrets. I found the good citizens of Pont-Aven had reasonable rights for posing. It was no problem to find a cowherd or a shepherdess to sit for me.
Now, Pont-Aven attracts artists actually from around the world, and you quickly become a leader whose opinions are sought after by many of the younger artists.
I was considered the best painter on Pont-Aven. True, it didn't put a penny in my pocket, but perhaps it was an omen of the future. I was a fool to give instructions so freely. Sooner or later, someone made use of my knowledge and my expertise without proper recognition.
Now, eventually returning to Paris that fall, you feel you are on the threshold of an artistic discovery.
Well, I didn't yet know what I was doing, but I felt I was closer than ever to finding out what that might be.
Now, meanwhile, back in Denmark, Met struggles to keep the family afloat, relying on her income as a teacher and the generosity of her friends and family. You maintain a sporadic correspondence with her, but that's also filled with recriminations and bitterness on both sides.
Well, my wife only appreciated me when I was making money. Poverty had completely soured her, and I was getting all the blame. I quite understood that my lousy painting had been the cause of her ruin, but she was not above trying to derive a profit from it either.
Now, seeking warmth and new inspiration, you actually leave Paris for Panama in April 1887. Your return to South America is viewed as a kind of artistic rebirth for you.
Well, I went to Panama to live like a savage. I took my brushes and my colors with the intention of rebaptizing myself far from humanity.
Now, what you find in Panama instead is disease, decay, corruption. You find work as a bookkeeper with a French organization that was, at that time, attempting to build the Panama Canal. And 2 months later, you save enough money to go to the French island of Martinique, a French colony then called the Little Paris.
Martinique was no paradise, but I could erase the bad parts from my paintings.
Unfortunately, you fall desperately ill with dysentery and malaria as a result of the unsanitary conditions you experienced in Panama.
I was so sick that I became a skeleton and I could hardly whisper. I regret not having died, for that would have solved everything.
Now, painting provides a distraction for you and helps to keep the pain at bay. Gradually, you break free from many of the Impressionist techniques.
Well, painting was a way to find the strength to live without too much bitterness. I spent days in quiet contemplation of nature, devoting myself entirely to my art. Without that, there would be no salvation. My work was never more clear or lucid.
Now, your 5-month stay in Martinique marks a turning point for you creatively, yes?
One must look to the works I brought back from Martinique rather than those in Brittany if one wants to know who I am.
Now, you return to Paris in November for medical treatment, and then you make the acquaintance of the Dutch artist Vincent van Gogh. Now, Vincent admires your Martinique paintings quite a bit and encourages his art dealer brother, Theo, to purchase 2 of them. Like you, Vincent sought the sun and dreamt of organizing a studio in the south, in Arles, one that would rival the Pont-Aven art community in the north.
I had a great respect for Vincent, but I didn't think much of his painting. Theo, however, was the sort of dealer I was looking for. The kind who could buy my work and keep me out of debt.
Now, you returned to Pont-Aven in February of 1888, searching for what you call a reasoned and frank return to the beginning, that is to say, primitive art. Winters cleared the town of artists and tourists, and you spend most of the time still in bed recovering from malaria. By summer, however, you've pretty much recovered and are joined by the young painter Émile Bernard, who is seeking a more direct expression in his art through a new style he calls symbolism.
Usually I assume the position of teacher with the young artists, but I found I had much to learn from Bernard. He took me away from the outdoors and led me to an interior world that was far richer.
Now, symbolism influenced the visual arts, literature, poetry, music, and theater at the time. It was a reaction against naturalism and realism, such as the Impressionists embodied, and it was more in favor of spirituality, the imagination, and dreams. The symbolist painters used mythology and dream imagery to create works that were intensely personal and what I would call more obscure or, in fact, ambiguous.
Well, when an artist removes himself from the logical, everyday world, he opens himself up to a world of dreams and poetry. Form and color, when combined in harmony, produce a poetry which touches the deeper recesses of the heart.
Now, you're fascinated by Bernard's technique referred to as cloisonnism, named after a medieval technique for decorative enamel work. The characteristics of cloisonnism are clearly defined outlines and bold coloring, and it almost resembles stained glass.
I resolved to take it a step further. I coined the term synthetism. I would combine the formal elements of painting with an idea or an emotion. Dreams are a deep and mysterious language. I would use that language to express an emotion rather than simply to reproduce facts.
Now, a seminal work exemplifying what you're describing is the vision after the sermon, Jacob Wrestling with the Angel, which you complete in September 1888. It depicts an imaginary scene of a priest and a group of women watching a man wrestling with an angel. Presumably, it represents a shared vision this group had had following a sermon they just heard in church.
The vision after the sermon is it's a new approach to the ancient spirit of the Gospels. I was bringing the old Bible stories to the world of Brittany. Jacob wrestling the angel is a man's struggle with himself. It's the artist wrestling with the imagination, struggling with a new art, grappling with all the forces that rage against him. I wanted to give it to the church. They didn't want it.
They may regret that today, I think. They might well have that in their collection. Now, Vision After the Sermon is a watershed work for you. It marks your clear break with Impressionism, with its dependence on nature, and imagination for you now seems to be the gateway for your art.
I sacrificed everything, execution, color, for style, because I forced myself to do something other than what I knew how to do. It was a change which had not yet borne fruit, but which I was confident would do so.
Now, since your separation from Met nearly 3 years before, you have claimed to live a life of celibacy. This runs fairly counter to your passionate nature, and your erotic impulses begin to focus on younger teenage girls. Bernard's 17-year-old sister, Madeline, is your first love interest since Met. She's a devout Catholic who rejects your advances because, well, to be honest, you have no money, no prospects, and you're still married. Not long later, you become infatuated with Judith, the 13-year-old daughter of a Swedish sculptor whose Paris studio is located below yours. You ask Madeline and Judith both to pose nude for you, and they both decline.
I was susceptible to beauty, but I did not know how to love. To say I love you to any woman would break all my teeth. I was anything but a poet. Women who were more experienced and shrewd understood this, and I repelled them.
Now, Van Gogh continues to barrage you with letters imploring you to join him in Arles. Theo Van Gogh actually sweetens the pot for you by offering you a monthly stipend in exchange for paintings, if you choose to go. Finally, you give in October of 1888, and you join Vincent at the Yellow House, a derelict structure with 4 tiny rooms, barely able to support one person, let alone 2 artists and 2 rather prickly egos.
Oh, you must come, you must come. He wrote over and over until I got tired of his pleading, and I went to him. I found that Arles was no Pontevin. The Yellow House was a rat hole. Vincent had set up studio space for 2, but his notion of tidiness did not match my own. I set about making order of chaos.
Now, you in fact establish a budget, and you set aside funds for food, rent, tobacco. You also save money for what you consider hygienic practices, which actually constitute a weekly trip to the local brothel. In an effort to economize, Van Gogh also does some of the cooking.
Vincent made soup like he mixed his paint colors. It was bright yellow like his paintings, and neither of us could eat it.
Now, Van Gogh's enthusiasm for painting outdoors seems a step back to Impressionism for you. But that's not the only thing that you guys disagree on, however.
Vincent put too much stress on the factual. I told him not to paint so much from nature. Accuracy mattered less than what comes from the imagination and how we feel. Art is, after all, an abstraction, and the act of making art is more important than the outcome.
Now, that autumn in Arles, it rains day after day after day, and life inside the Yellow House becomes unbearably tense for both of you. Fueled by alcohol, arguing, and some pretty severe competition between the two of you, Vincent mood swings grow more frequent and somewhat more violent. On more than one occasion, you've said you've woken up to find him standing by your bed, staring at you with scary expressions.
Vincent and I found it impossible to live together. Our temperaments were incompatible. I had intended to stay for 6 months. It became clear that would not be possible.
Now, because of the weather, you're both forced to work inside, and you begin to paint portraits of each other. Vincent, however, is appalled by your portrayal of him as a dazed, morose figure hunched over a canvas. He remarks that although it resembles him, it was him seemingly gone mad.
One night, we went to a cafe just before Christmas. Vincent ordered an absinthe, which he hurled at me. I ducked, I missed it, grabbed his arm and frog marched him home. He fell asleep instantly. The next morning, December 23rd, he apologized for what he had done, but I told him it was time I left. Things could only get worse between us.
Well, indeed, and in fact, what happens later that evening has become a notorious chapter in art history.
I went for a walk after dinner. The tension was too thick. I had nearly crossed the street when I heard behind me a familiar footstep. Short, quick, irregular. I turned about. At the very moment, Vincent rushed at me with an open razor in his hand. My look in that moment must have had great power in it, for he stopped and, lowering his head, he set off running toward home. I stayed that night in a hotel.
I think that was probably a good idea, because the next morning, in fact, you return to the Yellow House and see it surrounded by police and many gawking onlookers. I wonder what you actually inquire about Vincent, and what do you learn?
Well, they asked me what had I done to him. Apparently, they thought me guilty of murder. I found Vincent asleep, bleeding from his ear, but alive. I told the police to wake him very carefully and tell him I had left for Paris.
Now, before leaving, you learned further details of what had happened. Vincent had sliced off part of his left ear, wrapped it in a newspaper, and presented it to one of the prostitutes at the brothel that you'd frequented.
Vincent was a sincere friend. We eventually resumed our correspondence, but we never again shared a studio. When he killed himself 3 years later, I thought, now his suffering is at an end. I will forever see him in my eyes and in my heart when I look at his paintings. When Theo died 6 months later, I lost a dealer who knew how to promote my works. It was like being cut adrift.
Now, for the next several years, you alternate between living in Paris and Brittany. In Paris, you become acquainted with the avant-garde literary group of symbolist poets such as Stéphane Mallarmé, author Rimbaud, and Paul Verlaine. Accustomed to the role of mentor, you become their philosophical leader and, in fact, their favorite artist.
Well, Octave Mirbeau, a journalist and art critic who supported the symbolists, wrote, and I quote, Gauguin's work emanates a bitter and violent aroma of the poisons of the flesh. There is a dazzling and savory mixture of barbaric splendor and an obscene and subtle symbolism. Gauguin has created an altogether new and personal art, the art of a painter and poet, of an apostle. Rare perception, don't you think?
High praise indeed, high praise indeed. Now, when you return to Pont-Aven, you find it spoiled by tourists, and you actually relocate to the village of Le Poule-du. There you share a house with the Dutch artist Jacob Meyer de Haan, who you actually teach to paint.
De Haan and I made quite a pair, the hunchback and the hook nose. He was another redhead like Van Gogh, which should have put me off. We live like peasants, supported by his wealthy parents, in our house by the sea. Everything around us was harsh and impenetrable, like the Breton language.
Now, during that long winter, you and de Haan fill the dining room with paintings, including 2 door panels, which contain a self-portrait and your portrait of de Haan.
He was a portrait of good and evil. Every day one made the choice which door to walk through.
Now, there, in a heightened pursuit of raw emotional expression, you continue your focus on Bible stories. In Christ in the Garden of Olives, you actually paint yourself as the central figure.
That was me, but it was also symbolic of the crushing of an ideal and a pain which is both divine and human. Jesus is totally abandoned. His disciples are leaving him in a setting as sad as his soul.
Now, your further distaste for contemporary Western civilization is communicated with a carved and painted wood relief, which you bestow the ironic title, Be in Love and You Will Be Happy.
There is Gauguin, the married monster, seizing the hand of the protesting virgin. It was also my homage to Paris, that stinking, rotten Babylon which I was more determined than ever to leave.
Well, but in fact, you actually do return to Paris for a major exhibition of your work from Arles and Pont-Aven at the Café Volpini. You chose to exhibit 15 paintings, all framed in white, a pastel, a watercolor, and an album of prints. Your works, however, proved difficult to sell because they have a visual language that's intensely personal and certainly at odds with the Impressionist works, which were more currently in favor in the day.
At times I considered bashing my brain in and giving up in despair. I knew I would be understood less and less, but one must be unafraid and true to one's nature to the bitter end. For most people, I was an enigma, but for some, I was a poet. And sooner or later, merit would have its way.
Now, the 1889 Paris Universal Exposition provides a distraction for you. The ethnographic displays at the Esplanade des Invalides recreate native life drawn from France's colonies, including Africa, Asia, Polynesia. They capture your imagination and stimulate your dreams of actually now establishing a studio of the tropics. After considering Vietnam and Madagascar, you actually apply for a grant from the French Ministry of Colonies to travel to Tahiti, and they help and give you a 30% discount on the fare there.
Civilization had made me sick. I needed a period of rebirth, of incubation, somewhere where I could be closer to nature and to my true self.
Now, however, before you leave, you have an affair with a young seamstress, Juliette Huet. She bears you a daughter, Germaine, just 5 months after you leave for Tahiti.
I commemorated the affair in a painting. I was the fox, an Indian symbol of perversity. In the background, you can see the wedding party coming to rescue the virgin bride. They are too late.
Now, before you leave for Tahiti in March 1891, you traveled to Copenhagen to say goodbye to your family and to try and make amends with Met.
Met had been on her own too long. She was as independent as any man. All her feminine modesty was gone. When I spoke of her and the children joining me in Tahiti, she said nothing. We parted as friends, my illusions intact.
Now, 9 weeks later, you arrive in Papeete, Tahiti on June 8th, 1891, just the day after your 43rd birthday. Dressed in a brown velvet suit, purple shoes, and a Stetson hat, I'm sure you were quite the curious sight for the native peoples. Now, you come with a romantic image of Tahiti as a new Eden. It's actually partly derived from a popular novel of the time by Pierre Loti.
I came to Tahiti to forget all the bad things that had come before, and I was certain the future of Earth was to be found there. I left in order to find peace and quiet and to rid myself of the influence of civilization. I wanted to do very simple art, and in order to do that I had to immerse myself in nature, see only savages and live their life.
Now, you arrived just in time to observe the funeral of King Pomeré V, the last Maori ruler that was tolerated by French rule. Once the impressive rites for King Pomeré conclude, however, the French colonists and the native people go their separate ways.
Well, Papeete was a bad imitation of Europe, with its colonial snobism and the imitation grotesque, or even to the point of caricature of our customs, our fashions, our vices, and the absurdities of civilization. Why had I made this fair journey only to find the very thing which I had fled?
Now, after several months, because of this frustration, you moved 25 miles from Papeete to Matea on the south side of the island. You rent a bamboo hut and adopt the native dress, a pareo, which is a sort of wraparound skirt.
All the joys, animal and human, of a free life were mine. For the first time since unconcerned childhood, I felt my heart leap in my bosom when the dawn woke me. I was glad merely to see the sun rise or the rain fall. I was no longer in a prison that stifled.
Now, seeking to further bond with the natives, you learn their way of life, joining them on fishing expeditions, and you also make an effort to learn their language.
When my over-civilized soul was being cleansed and rejuvenated through contact with these people, I apprehended everything that invaded my being, and I felt the most amazing peace.
Now, Tahiti was a revelation, to say the least, and its landscapes a continual source of inspiration for you. You employ Tahiti titles, native iconography, and idyllic island landscapes in many of your paintings. Your woodcuts also and sculptures, in fact, take on the rough-hewn look that emulated the traditional Tahitian art.
Everything in the landscape blinded me, dazzled me. I shut my eyes to see. Coming from Europe, I was always uncertain of some color, but here it was so natural to put color on my canvas. And I could be certain that anything I painted here was unknown in France, and I hoped the newness would tip the balance in my favor.
Now, many of your Tahitian paintings continue to explore traditional Christian themes, but you place the subjects such as the Nativity and the Madonna and Child in Tahitian settings. You draw on a rather eclectic range of sources from borrowed Egyptian, Buddhist, and Greek art to develop a fictitious mythology. In the next 2 years, you produce 66 paintings, a huge number, and numerous sculptures that become immediately recognizable to the public as your work.
The ideas that guided my work were mysteriously linked to 1,000 other ideas, some of my own, some of others. Art is either a plagiarism or a revolution. If I did what had been done before, I would be a plagiarist, and I would consider myself unworthy.
Now, you're drawn to the dark skin and physical beauty of the Tahitian people, especially the women. You paint them in native sarongs, as well as wearing the loose granny dresses that were then instituted by the Christian missionaries.
Well, Tahitian women had that indescribable something. They were infinitely penetrating and mysterious. They were not pretty by European standards, but they were beautiful all the same. Their mouths spoke of joy and sadness, the melancholy of bitterness which mingles with pleasure, of passivity dwelling in dominion.
Now, although still legally married to Met, you go native and purchase a series of vahines, or mistresses. The first is a 13-year-old girl named Teja Amana. She models for many of your paintings and bears you a son who you name Emile.
Well, I understood that my skill as a painter would depend upon my physical and moral possession of my model, and that it would be like an implied, urgent, irresistible invitation. My Tahitian wife prepared simple meals for me every day and got down on her back whenever I wanted it. All for the humble reward of a frock and 10 francs a month.
Now, expecting to live frugally in Tahiti, you actually discover that it's incredibly expensive to import art supplies. Impressionism is still the favored style, and few seem very interested in purchasing your Tahitian paintings. You fear that your work will fade into obscurity and that less significant work will get noticed.
Well, there is always a great demand for fresh mediocrity. In every generation, the least cultivated taste has the largest appetite.
Unfortunately, I think that's still true today in many ways, yeah. Now, in December, you send 8 of your Tahitian paintings to Met in Copenhagen, where she has organized an exhibition. Now, the show is actually a success for you and results in some sales. And as well, you get much publicity in Scandinavian and German collecting circles.
Copenhagen was not Paris. I was not impressed. I convinced myself that I must either find a way back to Paris or else give up painting altogether.
Now, at a time when you're in desperate need of money, news reaches you through Met that you've received an inheritance from a Gauguin uncle. Now, for years, Met has struggled and bear the burden and responsibility for caring for your 5 children. She assumes that some of that money will go to help with the children and their education.
Well, I used the money for postcards and brochures and framing for an exhibition of my Tahitian work. It was my inheritance to do with as I pleased, after all. Met's bitterness and anger over the inheritance soured what was left of our marriage.
Now, by now, your health is becoming a significant issue for you. You're a heavy drinker, and in early 1892, you begin to spit up large quantities of blood. Now, a doctor in Papeete diagnoses heart trouble, but the real culprit is syphilis, which you had contracted many years earlier when you were a young sailor.
I am not one to speak ill of life. You suffer, but you also enjoy. And however small that enjoyment, that is what you remember. And who knows, perhaps the alcoholics and the syphilitics will be the men of the future.
Now, with the last of your funds, you sail for Europe in June 1893, saying goodbye to your Tahitian wife, Teja Amana, as she throws white flowers into the sea, which was a traditional farewell. You go directly to Paris to show off the work that you'd produced in Tahiti. The critics find your work artificially exotic, and they seem to mistrust the authenticity of the feelings behind the paintings. The artist Degas, however, sees promise in them and convinces the art dealer Durand Ruel to mount a one-man show of your work in his gallery. Of the 44 works in the show, however, you sell only 11. Even more disappointment occurs when your sculpture, Oviri, which translates as savage, is rejected for entry into the 1895 Salon.
Well, the story of modern art is the story of the progressive loss of art's audience. What the public wants to understand in a single day, a single hour, what the artist has spent years learning. Exhibitions attracted only enemies. It was better to sell privately.
Now, while in Paris, you begin work on Noa Noa, an artist's notebook and travel log that weaves together Tahitian religious beliefs with your personal experiences on the island. The narrative is illustrated by 10 woodcuts that show the Tahitian origins of life mythology.
I was inspired by an unconscious sentiment born of solitude and savagery. From the harmony with the nature that surrounded us, there emanated a beauty, a fragrance called Noa Noa. It enchanted my artist soul. Teja Amana had told me stories of the old religion. I learned from her, and she learned from me at night, in bed, in conversation.
Now, escaping the heat of a Parisian summer, you and a new mistress, a half-Indian and half-Malaysian woman known as Anna the Javanese, and her pet monkey, I have to say, set off to explore your favorite haunts in Brittany. Now, on a day trip to the harbor town of Concarneau, you get in a brutal fight with a group of locals.
There were 9 of us on the quay. It began with stone throwing and insults, and a group of drunks began to attack Anna. I put up a heroic defense. I threw out two of the assailants, but then I felt the terrible sensation of having put my foot in a hole. I had been kicked in the shin with a clog. The bone pierced my skin just above the ankle. I was barely conscious when they took me to the hospital.
And in fact, your ankle never heals properly and becomes, to use your own words, one great wound. You begin injecting morphine to relieve the pain of that particular injury. Now, while you're recuperating, Anna actually steals everything of value from your studio and disappears. Now, thankfully, she does leave your paintings intact.
The life I had known in Paris had passed me by. In my hospital room, I was like a wounded animal with no outlet.
Now, in February 1895, you hold another sale to finance a return to Tahiti. The well-known art dealer Ambrose Bollard expresses an interest in representing you, and you hash out a deal that benefits you both. You will ship marketable paintings, and what I mean by that is some simpler, prettier work that's stripped of the allegory and folklore which you had been painting, and in exchange each month you receive a sum that will enable you to live comfortably in Tahiti. In July 1895, you leave France for the last time.
Well, let them say Gauguin is finished, and nothing more will be seen of him. In Tahiti, I could be free to paint without thoughts of glory. I wanted to end my days as a free man with no concern for tomorrow and without battling all the time with idiots.
Now, Tahiti has changed considerably since you left. Electricity has come, merry-go-rounds are installed, cyclists now ride on the bumpy roads, tennis is played on manicured lawns. Because you need reliable medical treatment, you construct a house a short distance from the hospital that's run by the French military.
Well, I was proud of my first attempt at architecture. It had a beautiful location and a gorgeous view of the mountain. At night, the moonlight filtered through the reeds like an instrument of music.
Now, to ease the pain of a variety of health concerns, and I've got quite a list here, it includes eczema, syphilis, a heart condition, rotting teeth, open sores on your legs, complications for malaria, which you'd contracted in Panama, and a liver ruined by years of heavy drinking. You now self-medicate with morphine and drink even more heavily. One of your favorite cocktails is a blend of absinthe with lime and pomegranate juices, which you call a Dr. Funk. Now, despite the grim nature of your illnesses, you continue to paint, believing that your best work is yet to come.
But my old sweetheart, Teha Amana, returned to me, a married woman. We fooled her husband and ran away for a week, but when she saw how sick I was, she returned to him. That was the end of our arrangement. I still had my share of frenzied young girls to invade my bed, but it was time to install a more responsible woman in the house.
Now, you acquire a new vahine. She's 15-year-old Pahura, who is willing to share her life with a man more than 3 times her age and in obvious physical decline. She calls you her rascal.
My Tahitian Eve was very subtle, very knowing in her naivete. There was a riddle in her eyes which I could not understand.
Now, Pahura becomes pregnant and gives birth to a daughter. Now, unfortunately, that child dies just a few days after being born.
I named the child Eileen after my daughter who had been born on the same day 19 years earlier. The Son of Man is my version of the Nativity. Pahura was the model, and I wanted to show an earthier side of the story, to present the maternal experience in a more universal way.
Now, you and Pahura have another child later whose descendants actually still live on the island today, and you can still recognize them by their distinctive Gauguin nose. Now, on April 1897, Met sends news that your daughter there, Aileen, died of pneumonia at the beginning of the year. Although you'd only spent about a week with Aileen over the last decade or so, she was really, as you mentioned before, the only child who ever touched your heart. You lash out at Met in a series of letters blaming her for the misfortune that had befallen your beloved Aileen.
Well, at first, the news did not affect me at all, hardened as I had been to suffering for a long time. But each day as the thoughts piled in, the wound opened up deeper and deeper until it completely overwhelmed me.
Now, believing that your own time is limited, you set about making an artistic summary of your life's work. The monumental 4.5-foot by 12-foot painting, Where Do We Come From, What Are We, Where Are We Going, is a meditation on the cycle of life, birth, temptation, death, and back again. It is considered by many your greatest masterpiece.
Well, before I died, I wanted to complete a very large canvas, and I worked day and night for a month in a terrible fever. I would never paint anything better or even like it. I poured all of my passion and energy into it. My conditions were so terrible, but my vision was so clear. It didn't matter that the execution was rushed because the life surged up from it. When it was finished, it was a philosophical work that was like a gospel.
Now, in 1897, late in the year, very ill and convinced that your own creative life is over, you attempt suicide by drinking the arsenic which you previously rubbed into the open sores on your legs to cauterize them.
I went into the mountain as high as I could climb, and so my body would not be found, and I would be devoured by the ants. I laid down, swallowed the poison, and waited for the end. I vomited it all up, lost consciousness. After a night of terrible suffering, I returned home.
Now, you then learn that another Universal Exposition will be held in Paris to welcome the new century. You rush to complete a series of landscapes, but it's a missed opportunity as you're too late to have them included in the Fine Art Pavilion.
Yeah, perhaps it was a blessing in disguise. The public, who demands the greatest degree of originality on the painter's part, ends up not accepting him if his work does not resemble that of others.
Now, needing money to support your morphine addiction, you launch a satirical journal, Le Sourire, which means the smile, whose sole purpose is to attack the colonial institutions which you've come to despise. You're the writer, illustrator, publisher, and distributor of the journal, and it runs 9 months. It becomes quite a favorite of the local natives. Now, you also complete a brief autobiography written for both a contemporary audience as well as posterity. And in it, you emphasize your reputation as a rebel, your artistic innovation, as well as being a libertine.
I was proud of my family's tradition of journalism, and I could handle a pen as well as a brush. With Le Sourire, I chose a target each month and exposed the truth as I saw it. That got their attention.
I'm sure it did. Now, by 1901, you were regarded as a pariah on Tahiti. Your muckraking efforts through the journal against the colonists and libelous remarks against government officials have made you some pretty powerful enemies. Your Vahine Pohura has left you, and life on the island has become much too civilized for your tastes. You gather what strength and money remain and move 1,000 miles northeast of Hiva Oa on the Marquesas. That's part of the most remote island chains in the world. The Marquesans mob you when you arrive, as your fame as a journalist has preceded you.
Well, Tahiti had become a little unhealthy for me. It was time for me to find a more simple land. The Marquesas were a promised land with more acres, food, and game than one knew what to do with, and officials as gentle as sheep to lead one about.
Now, the prime piece of property on which you'd like to build a house is controlled by the Catholic bishop, Father Martin. He was away for several weeks, so a sale could not be made, but during his absence, you make sure that the land will become yours.
I went to Mass every Sunday for a month, and I forced myself to play the role of a good Catholic. My reputation was made, and His Reverence, not suspecting my hypocrisy, was more than happy to sell me a small plot of ground.
Now, 2 female nudes guard the entrance of this new 2-story home, and the words Maison de Jouir, which is translated into House of Orgasm, is carved into the elaborate lintels.
Well, the location was perfect. I could watch the young ladies coming and going from the girls' school a block away. I used the front lawn as a stage for art guaranteed to offend the neighbors. I carved Bishop Martin as a devil, and I put him opposite another statue of a nude woman named for one of his mates.
Now, visitors that come to visit you there remember seeing rooms decorated with family photographs and copies of many of your favorite paintings. However, also pornographic postcards picked up at Port Said are used as conversation starters with many of your female guests. If they show an interest, you attempt to get to know them, let's say, more intimately. Now, there's also carvings of penises on cane handles, as well as objects of art scattered around the house. And oftentimes people remember arias by Handel playing on the harmonium.
Well, aside from the annoyance of the priest, it was perfect. I was a tough old cock and well seasoned. The priest wanted to condemn me to a lifetime of celibacy. It was too much.
Now, your last companion, Vallejo, is a 14-year-old girl that you actually exchanged for cloth and ribbons from the general store. She bears you a daughter in September 1902. Now, sir, you at this time have 4 children from 4 women other than your wife.
Well, I found a little dog. I named him Pego. That's sailor talk for the male member. It gave me immense pleasure to call my little friend within earshot of the nuns who ran the girls' school.
Now, in April 1902, you shipped 20 paintings to Vollard. In agonizing pain and unable to stand any longer, you actually ceased painting and began gathering all your notes, letters, and formal articles in a memoir called Avant et Après, Before and After.
The work of a man is the explanation of the man. I loved only painting. Neither wife nor child. My heart was empty, and now it seemed that I was condemned to live after I had lost all moral reason for living. Writing was a way to pass what time remained. I wrote like I painted my pictures, following my fancy and following the moon.
Now, before and after expresses what I would consider your life philosophy as well.
It can be boiled down to 2 simple ideas. No one is good, no one is evil. Everyone is both, at the same time and in different ways. And it is such a short thing, the life of a man. But there is time to do great things, fragments of the common task.
Now, still dependent on injections of morphine as well as alcohol, you briefly considered going back to Paris for medical treatment. You were dissuaded from doing so, however, by the art dealer who thinks it would diminish the power of mystery that you've generated.
Time came when people thought that was a myth, or rather something the newspapers had made up.
Now, the year 1903 begins dramatically when a cyclone hits the island on January 13th, destroying much of the property. Now, remarkably, your house remains standing and rather untouched.
Alone in my hut, I thought I would be blown away. But I was a far-sighted sailor who built high and well. Even then I was just about by our wind, but God, who I had offended so often, saw reason to spare me.
Now, 2 months later, you're actually charged with libeling the island's governor and given 3 days to prepare your defense. You lose the case and are fined 500 francs and sentenced to 1 month in prison for slander. Now, you do eventually appeal that, however.
Well, I was charged with inciting the natives to rebel by telling them their rights. My real crime was not groveling to the authorities.
After an overdose of morphine and a possible heart attack, you pass away at 11 a.m. on May 8th, 1903, at age 54. You're denied a Christian burial by the local priests who branded you a contemptible individual, reputed artist, and an enemy of God. You are interred within 3 hours because your body is so quickly deteriorating in the hot sun. As requested, your sculpture Overy, the Savage, be buried with you. News of your death will not reach Copenhagen or Paris for many months later, not until August.
The life of man is little more than a fraction of a second. Such a short time to prepare oneself for eternity.
Now, before we ask our final questions for you, I wonder if there's any final thoughts you'd like to share with our audience.
I was a savage, in spite of myself. I held freedom and the right to dare anything above all human values. I saw the world with less civilization and more meaning. I found one by not finding the other. I was right about art. And if my works endure, may they be the legacy of an artist who tried to set painting free.
Thank you, thank you. Now, as we do with all of our artists, we like to ask our final 10 questions that are inspired by the French journalist Bernard Pivot. I wonder if you would indulge us and join me in that today.
Certainly.
Thank you. What, sir, is your favorite word?
Freedom.
What is your least favorite word?
Civilization.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Wildness.
What turns you off?
Virtue.
What is your favorite curse word?
Putain.
What sound or noise do you love?
The sound of the tide coming in, or clogs resounding on the pavement.
What sound or noise do you hate?
The braying of idiots.
What profession other than your own would you like to have attempted?
Teacher.
What profession would you like to not have done?
Salesman.
If heaven exists, and you now know that whether that's true or not, what would you like to hear God say when you enter the pearly gates?
I wish only that he would leave me in peace.
Mr. Gauguin, thank you so much. Thank you so much for a fantastic afternoon together, and thank you for sharing your life and your work with us. Thank you all of you for joining us today. Thank you, Ed and Susie, for your wonderful support. Thank you, Margie, for all of your hard work, the rest of the staff, our members, everyone who makes everything here we do possible. Now, as we did the last couple of times, in a few minutes here, Paul is going to come back as Andrew, and he and Margie and I will be available to answer any questions that you may have. Otherwise, please enjoy our exhibit upstairs. This is the last week for our juried biennial. We have 3 new exhibits opening over the next couple of weeks. So please continue to come back and patronize the Museum of Art. And thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.